Where Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel announced she has charged a Michigan State Police trooper with second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter in the death of Samuel Sterling.
Amber Kriska is here with details on the charges. Amber?
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. While I hesitate to say that this is a good day because ultimately 2 young men are still dead and there's nothing that can be done to bring them back, it's at least a move in the right direction as I have positive updates to 2 cases that I've previously covered. You may recall that I covered the murders of both Airman Roger Fortson by the Acorn County Sheriff's Office in Florida, as well as Samuel Sterling, the man who was senselessly run over by a Michigan State Police trooper who was attached to a federal task force. As I mentioned, we do have important updates on both cases, so let's do the best one first. Now, I have gotten this story from a local news source, so please head over to their channel and give them credit for sharing it. But for now, let's listen to the Michigan Attorney General as she announces that she has charged the trooper involved in the killing of Samuel Sterling with murder.
About 40 days after Samuel Sterling was killed, Attorney General Dana Nessel made the announcement in the last hour on social media saying Samuel Sterling's death could have been prevented. The AG's office filed charges today against Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Brian Keeley for 1 count of murder in the second degree or 1 count of involuntary manslaughter. Investigators say Neely was trying to bring Sterling into custody on April 17th. Keeley's unmarked cruiser hit the 25-year-old at a nearby fast food restaurant parking lot. Nessel says her office reviewed multiple police reports from officers on scene, looked at the autopsy, as well as watched body cam footage and surveillance video before making this decision.
We have found that Detective Sergeant Keeley's actions that day were legally, grossly negligent and created a very high risk of death or great bodily harm, which could have otherwise been prevented.
So if you haven't seen my video where I predicted that this would happen, there would be a second-degree murder charge brought against this trooper. You should be able to find a link at the end of this video. Please go back and watch that video for a more in-depth analysis of why I thought he should have been charged. But suffice it to say, I'm pleased that this was done, and I fully expect him to be convicted under the circumstances because of the fact that Mr. Sterling posed no real threat to do anything except flee, and therefore deadly force was unjustified based on the Tennessee versus Garner standard. Now, I'll provide more updates as this case moves along, but it will take a while to play out. Again, the Grand Rapids officer who killed Patrick Leoya in 2022 still hasn't gone to trial. These things take a while. I don't expect that the officer is going to plead guilty because he's going to want to try to play on some sort of public sympathy, but ultimately I do expect it to go to trial, and I do expect the trooper to be convicted of something, maybe a lesser included manslaughter or whatever. Now we pivot to another case we covered on the channel where a Florida deputy shot United States Airman Roger Fortson while he was standing in the threshold of his home and holding a gun. Yesterday, Okaloosa County Sheriff Eric Aiden released the deputy's identity to the public and announced his firing.
Sheriff Eric Aiden has released the name of the deputy who shot and killed a Hurlburt Field airman and has also decided to fire him. Aiden made the announcement today as he released the Sheriff's Office internal administrative investigation of the May 3rd shooting for 23-year-old Roger Fortson. Deputy Eddie Duran showed up to Fortson's Fort Walton Beach apartment in response to a domestic violence report. When Fortson answered the door, Duran's body camera video, as you see here, shows Fortson holding a gun in his right hand. It was pointed at the floor. Duran's gun was already drawn. He fired 5 shots at Fortson in just under 1 second. He was hit several times in the chest. Fortson later died at a hospital from his wounds. The statement releasing the internal investigation results, the Sheriff Aiden wrote, "This tragic incident should have never occurred. The objective facts do not support the use of deadly force as an appropriate response to Mr. Fortson's actions. Mr. Fortson did not commit any crime. By all accounts, he was an exceptional airman and individual." He went on to say in this case, the former deputy did not meet the standard of objective reasonableness and his use of control to resistance was excessive. This internal investigation only determined whether or not Eddie Duran followed Sheriff's Office policy and procedures. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement is conducting a criminal investigation into the shooting. If they come back with similar findings, Duran could face criminal charges. in Fortson's death.
Now, someone has posted the final investigative report released by the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, and I would encourage anyone interested to go read the report for themselves. But the basics of the report, if you don't want to take time to read them, are these. Despite the fact that the moron sheriff came out and did a press conference improperly coloring the facts, the final investigation has revealed several inconsistencies with what Sheriff Eric Aden said at the press conference. You'll recall that in the press conference, the sheriff first offered condolences to the Fortson family, and in the same breath made a statement of solidarity with his deputies by suggesting that he was also thinking of them during this time. He then took issue with what he called a false narrative, and then emphatically said that the deputy announced his presence not once, but twice. And he even stated that Fortson did acknowledge that it was law enforcement at the door and answered the door with a firearm in his hand. He also edited the body cam video that he released to the public and was sure to plant what he wanted all of us to believe by making sure that he captioned parts of the body cam footage to make it look like Fortson was aggressive and acknowledged the police and answered the door with a gun. Now, while Sheriff Aden said words suggesting there wouldn't be a rush to judgment, in my opinion, the subliminal hints and tactics he used to manipulate the public made it clear that he thought the shooting was justified. Well, 4 weeks later, the internal investigation has revealed that what actually happened is something a little bit different than what Aden suggested. For one, the deputy admitted that he made multiple knocks on the door without announcing that he was law enforcement, and he did so he could listen for some sort of response and to hear what was going on. Not unreasonable, and so there was no reason for the sheriff to try to paint this in a way that it wasn't actually factually accurate. The deputy did announce at some point, or maybe 2 points, that he was police, but not at first, and he did it intentionally. Second, the deputy acknowledged that because of the position of the apartment door and pursuant to his training, he went back and forth from the sides of the door and did not stand where he could be seen in the doorway through the peephole. Now, this is also not unreasonable or out of the ordinary. This is tactical response 101 stuff. You don't stand directly in front of the door because it's a death funnel. You stand in the corners in case someone shoots through the door. If you're in the corners, the frame of the door is more protective than a direct hit. The deputy further admitted that he heard the word police, but he couldn't confirm that Fortson knew it was the police. He did say that he believed Fortson knew, but when questioned further, he couldn't provide any explanation for why he believed that. The interview with Fortson's girlfriend revealed that Fortson was playing a video game and talking to her on the phone during the knocking, and that Fortson heard the knocking and didn't know who it was. He looked out the peephole and didn't see anybody, and then he ended up telling his girlfriend that he was going to go get his gun. And so he left the living room to go get his gun from the bedroom, which could have been when the deputy announced that it was the police. So what we're looking at is an absolute tragedy unfolding. The deputy's knocking on the door. He's listening for a response. Fortson potentially decides to go get his gun because the deputy hasn't said it's the police. And while he's gone, the deputy says it's police and he doesn't hear it. And then he comes back and he answers the door with a gun. The girlfriend said that neither of them realized it was the police, that they never heard the word police, and that Fortson intentionally got the gun because he said no one ever knocked on his door and he didn't know who it was. The deputy went on to describe Fortson's expression as angry and aggressive and sort of like off-put that he had been knocking on the door. They did the body cam frame breakdown. The door opened, and within 1.5 seconds, the deputy said, "Step back." Fortson is described as taking a very slight step forward. Again, my argument for this is that it sounded to me, from listening to the body cam, that he said, "Step out." So it's entirely possible that Fortson heard what I thought I heard when he said, "Step out," and that his slight move forward was in compliance. Again, he opens the door. 3.4 seconds, the deputy fired the first shot, and by 4.4 seconds later, he had fired 5 shots. So within 3 seconds, the guy gets an order to step back and then gets shot 5 times by the deputy, who admitted during the interview that he didn't notice the gun at first, which goes in line with exactly what I said when I did the initial video, that it looked to me like the deputy first made contact with him and didn't notice the gun and then freaked out when he saw it. And he won't admit that that's what happened, but that's what happened. Now, I'll do a further breakdown once the Florida Department of Law Enforcement decides what they're going to do with it, but the way that Aden came out in defense of this situation at first leads me to believe that the reason they put this out is because he's going to be charged. In doing some research for these Florida officer-involved shooting cases, what I've noticed is that in most of the cases where I've been able to find a Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigation where the officer was cleared, they don't release the officer's name. And in cases where the shooting was ruled unjustified, they release the name. So to me, this is a signal, at least in my opinion, that criminal charges are inbound. Now again, I have linked the final investigative report, and I encourage you to go read it. It is interesting if you're interested in that kind of thing. And I do have to commend at least the internal investigators for Okaloosa County, because they found what we all know to be true, which was that in standing in the threshold of your own doorway, when the police don't have any reasonable articulable suspicion for a detention of you, and holding a gun is not illegal. We all could see with our own eyes that this was a completely unjustified shooting. And I do have to commend the internal investigators of Okaloosa County for at least putting it on the record, what we all know to be true, and not trying to cover it up. In closing, I am glad to see that Eric Aiden fired this deputy, but it would feel a lot better if he hadn't started the case out by making excuses and acting like this was justified. Now the deputy has a reason to cry about being singled out when the sheriff initially signaled public support, in addition to the family having a claim against the department. I'll never understand why the heads of these agencies are so short-sighted that they can't see what's going to happen. They just can't help but engage in like an initial cover-up. It's like muscle memory. And for reasons I previously stated, I believe this is the tip of the iceberg and that this deputy will be charged with some level of homicide. I don't believe they would have fired him if that weren't on the horizon, because again, they started off victim blaming and acting like this was a reasonable shoot. Now, as far as the Michigan case goes, I fully thought that was a clear-cut disproportional response and that the trooper would be charged. I had many people in my comments saying nothing would happen in either of these cases, but I believe, based on the facts, that neither of these cases were justified. I do have to admit it was a closer call in the Fortson case, simply because he was holding a gun, and that always makes it tricky. Now, one thing I have seen in the Michigan case is that a lot of people were taking issue with the statement that the trooper's lawyer came out with in response to him being charged. So a brief note on lawyers. This is something you should already understand about lawyers, but I'm going to explain it if you don't. Lawyers are the prostitutes of the professional world. I know that's crude to say, and I'd like to suggest to you that there's a better analogy, but there really isn't. In the same way that prostitutes range in quality from desperate on the street corner to Heidi Fleiss level high-end beautiful escorts, lawyers exist on a continuum as well. And in the same way, a prostitute is willing to pretend that she's attracted to her client long enough to get the job done. An attorney has to be able to see the merits in whichever side is going to hire him to advance the case. So even if you're completely wrong and unreasonable, if you search long enough and you have enough money to put up, you'll find a lawyer who's willing to stand in a courtroom and argue the merits of your case. And you really shouldn't expect anything different. If the position of a lawyer wasn't available for purchase, then none of you would be able to go find a lawyer when you're guilty of doing something or when you're wrong, but you still do it. A lawyer has an ethical obligation to defend the merits of the client's case. That's it. We're like empty, soulless shipping containers ready to be filled with the relevant facts of your case and delivered to the port of reasonable doubt or the port of preponderance or the evidence or whatever your case requires. So take it easy on the lawyer. He's just doing his job. I'm glad we're seeing some movement on these cases, and I fully expect a conviction, at least in the Michigan case. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Florida, but we'll keep you posted as relevant changes happen. Anyway, that's all for this one, guys. Thanks for sticking it out. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment on the video. Let me know what you think of this update. Also, if you have some time, check out some of the other videos on the channel and leave a comment on there as well. Until I see you again, take care. Always film your interactions with the police and keep your evidence to yourself.